Good afternoon and good day to everybody in this webinar. We are honored to have you all here, the esteemed speakers and valuable audience. Welcome to International Webinar Series 5, organized by Architecture Program, Universiti Teknologi Malaysia. For your information, this is our 5th International Webinar Series after our 4th in the last week, together with Sasi Creative School of Architecture in India. And for this webinar series, it is more special in a way that we have 3 architecture schools from 3 different countries to collab and disseminate knowledge to the audience present here. And with that, let me bid a sincerest welcome to School of Architecture, University of Sheffield, United Kingdom, and School of Architecture, Vellore Institute of Technology, India. And not to forget the audience to the webinar series today, not only from United Kingdom, India, and Malaysia, but potentially all over the world. We welcome you with open heart and thank you for joining our International Webinar Series 5. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Tengku Intan Suraya from Universiti Teknologi Malaysia. I'll be responsible for hosting this session today, and I'm glad to welcome our first speaker for this webinar series, Dr. Tanzil Shafique, who is an assistant professor from School of Architecture, University of Sheffield, who will be talking about lesson from informal housing. Our second speaker from School of Architecture, Vellore Institute of Technology, Assistant Professor Renuka Devi, who will be talking about rethinking housing with respect to cultural identity. And last but not least, our third speaker from Universiti Teknologi Malaysia, Associate Professor Dr. Sabrina Ismail, the Director for the Architecture Program here, will be talking about designing elderly housing with sense of communal value. For the viewers of this webinar, I will attach the link to attendance form in the chat box somewhere towards the end of the session. Filling the attendance will allow you to get an e-certificate. And please take note, for each speaker, the time allocated for each talk is 30 minutes, and we are going to start with our speaker number 1, followed by speaker number 2, and finally with speaker number 3. Subsequently, we are going to have another 30 minutes Q&A session with the speakers. So audience are free to ask questions during this period, and should you have any question during the talk, please drop your question in the chat section at the bottom right corner of the WebEx window for me to collect and bring it forward during the Q&A session afterwards. So without further ado, I shall welcome our first speaker of the session, Dr. Tanzil Shafique from School of Architecture, University of Sheffield, with the title Lesson from Informal Housing. The discourse is about the spectre that haunts how we think about housing, describing it in binaries, in oppositions, in essentialized identities, whether it is formal or informal, north or south, social or spatial, product or process. What does a more nuanced understanding of assemblages? This study outlines a conceptual framework where housing is rethought as an unfolding of social material processual relations and desire forming field of intensities. With this, I give this room to Dr. Tanzil Shafique to take over, and the room is yours, Doctor.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to be here. Thank you for inviting. So, time is pretty short, so I'll just start straight away. I'll share my screen and just let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'll be presenting the work primarily from my doctoral dissertation, which I did at the University of Melbourne. And I must acknowledge that I'm also an honorary member of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub, apart from my position at Sheffield. So I'm part of that research hub in University of Melbourne as well. So the research is done for my PhD, but also in association with this center. So I'll be talking about the morphogenesis, which is the transformation of the urban form in one particular neighborhood in in Dhaka, and Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. And as you can see in my screen, the changes that has happened in the last 20 years in one particular settlement known as Karail. And Karail is the largest informal settlement in Dhaka, housing about 300,000 people. So this is 2001, and this is the western edge of Karail. So this is not the entire settlement, but this is how the settlement has expanded onto the nearby lake. And the purpose of my study was to understand how this housing production, primarily housing production, took place. Okay, so just a brief about the content. Because it's 30 minutes, I'm not going to go over all the things in detail, but primarily we'll just talk about, talk about the context, which is the background, concepts and methods I used, and the findings, and then finally a discussion. So this is an aerial view of Karail, and you can see also in the map on the right-hand side that it's located quite centrally in the city. And then on the right, you see the most affluent and upper-class neighborhood to the right. And then the settlement primarily serves this upper-class neighborhood on that side. And then what you see is a lake system. So it's an artificial lake system that separates the two. So that's a bit of the geography. If we take a larger view at the city, so this is 30 kilometer by 30 kilometer, and then these are all the quote-unquote slum locations in Dhaka. And you see that the square that I was showing you before, this is actually 1.5 kilometer square right in the middle. So you start to see that Karail is located quite centrally within Dhaka, while most of the other settlements are towards the edge. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, interestingly, I mean, the first point of departure for us is that when I say I'm interested in the housing in informal settlement, I consciously am not equating it to slums. And we have actually written a paper on why informal settlement is not an euphemism that we should use to talk about slums, because we're interested, at least I'm interested in the urban production that happens beyond the state and capitalist institution, as opposed to substandard conditions. Usually, that's the definition of slums. So even if your house technically has no running water, according to the United Nations definition, your house can be termed as a slum. As opposed to, I'm interested in how people can come together and then, make city by themselves without the state or without large-scale corporations, building. In this map, what I show you is the logic of Dhaka's growth, and you can see all the red boxes in the map are places that have been designed by the government or by private corporations. So the rest of the city, all the yellow is kind of like the street morphology, is informally produced. So those include urban, villages that have been urbanized. They include, informal settlements. They include squatter settlements. They include, peripheral villages such as this. So all those are not consciously state planned. So that's kind of like the larger theoretical framing for the talk. So what's really the question here? The question is, when we look at informal settlements, we often talk about with some of these words, like they're organic, they're spontaneous, they're unplanned, they're self-organized. But we know a lot about how the formal construction, the formal part of urban design, that works, but not so sure about the informal, because I mean, what does it mean to say that something is self-organized, and what does it mean to say organic? Because that doesn't explain anything. It's just using a word to sum up a lot of different processes that goes on. So that's kind of like where the traditional language that we use probably does not really make sense. So in my PhD, I was trying to understand what is that, what are these processes that goes on within an informal settlement. So So the research question is, what are the organizing processes of Carrel's morphogenesis, which is the production of the urban form? What are the relations that assemble the urban form? And what is the driving logic behind the processes and relations? So there are 4 lines of inquiry, like 4 things that I investigated. So one was the morphological change itself. So how did the form, urban form, change? Secondly, what were the roles, like who were involved in making these decisions? And then what are the desires, like why did people? So it's a question of, if 1 is what, then 2 is roles, so who. So 3 is desires, or why did they make these changes? What are these forces of change, the desires that intersect to produce the changes? And number 4 is rules. So what are the different rules that emerge? What are the sort of repetitions that structure the change? So these are 4 different lines of inquiry. I'm not really going to go into the detail of assemblage thinking. So my theoretical framework is derived from the work of Deleuze and Guattari. But it's very difficult to go into detail about it. I'm going to take up half an hour just for that. So I do have a paper on that in housing studies, and if anyone is interested for the larger theoretical framework, I suggest them to look at that. So this was the method. It's a very mixed method framework. So I did field work, mapping, insight, but also like a sort of an ethnography. So it's mixed between spatial and social analysis. So we'll just go straight into the findings, and we'll talk about particular aspects of it. So this is what you saw, that how the buildings sort of emerge in this last 20 years. And if you map how the settlement has extended, and you see the red is the extent of the settlement, how it has come about. Now you start to notice that if you actually analyze how much it has grown, then you start to notice that initially it decreased. So in the first 2-3 years, actually the settlement, whatever it was on the edge, it was demolished by the government, so it went down. But then every year it doesn't increase in the same rate. So suddenly in 2014 you see a very large spike, and the question is, like, why would it differ? Like, what are the factors that cause it to change at different rates in different years? So 2014, I'll come back to that in the end. Like, why did this happen in 2014 so much? Now, if we start and if we look at that 500 meter by 500 meter, and then we map that growth. So 2001 is yellow, 2018 is red. So it's a gradation of growth, right? So the color slowly is turning reddish as it's newer, as it's newly built. So you can see in the lake how it's, the lake is reclaimed and then housing is built. If you notice the 2 arrows, you'll see that the southern side is much slower, and the northern side grows much faster. So larger in the same area, in the same time period, larger sections of it are encroached onto the lake. Now, the question is, what is that unit of growth? So one of my propositions was what I call single room dwelling units. So essentially, a single room is sort of like an apartment where each family lives. So a very typical housing structure is like a housing unit would be like 8 or 6 apartments together. So you can see in this one, the blue is the communal washing, and then you have like 8 or 7 or 6 of these apartments, and then there is a common gate to that compound. So that's a kind of like a diagram to represent this plan. So this is what gets repeated every time there is this growth. So I took 4 different sections. So you can see here on the right, 4 different sections in the settlement, and then I mapped out what are these units, and then or compounds rather. So you can start to see that usually, yes, you will have like compounds of let's say here, very typical, 8 rooms here, but you have compounds that have 40 rooms here, You have compounds which are, 70 rooms on this side, but also you have compounds which are just basically one room, like for example this one, or even this one. So you can have someone who just has one room, in Karal. So this is kind of like an analysis of the housing cluster formation. This was analyzing the service. So I'll not go into the detail, but this was mapping out who built the toilets and where. So you'll see kind of like an even distribution, so that in terms of access to water, access to washing, it's quite self-sufficient and it's quite evenly distributed. So one of the logic was the what I call the livability limit of sharing services, which is approximately every 30 person shares the toilet. So if you have 8 rooms, which is roughly 30 people, after that, if you have 12 rooms, you need the house, whoever is building the house, they need to get one more toilet. So basically, for every 8 rooms, this was applied. This was like a logic that I found in all the different neighborhoods within the settlement, that every 8 rooms would have roughly one toilet. This was just about a materiality of how the materials changed over time. So you can see the era of time. So before it was all bamboo and mud and polythene that was used to make it, and then slowly over time you see kind of like the durability increasing. So the material, a lot of it now is brick and mortar walls, and even some concrete roofs. But mostly the part that I studied is metal sheet. Streets and laneways. So one of the characteristics, of course, that we study in urban design is the character of streets and laneways. So you can start to see that the red is the formal city, and then even though it's right in the middle, you start to see that there is a logic of ghettoization. So there is only one major road that has access to it. So even if one has to go from here to here, they will have to take take the road from there. So access is socially controlled. So it's kind of like an unjust spatial formation at that scale of the settlement. And this is kind of like how, and now you also start to see that how the streets formed are quite different in the north and the south. And you have this more comb-like structures in the southern part, but in the north you start to see that it's starting to make a block-like formation. And we'll go into this logic also. This is a map of the public versus the private laneways. So anything that is orange is publicly accessible, you can walk in. The white laneways are laneways that are behind the gate. So if you don't know someone in that household, you don't really use it. But if you know someone, you just open the gate and and you can walk in, and you can use shortcuts even. So this is what I call a relational access network, because permeability is determined by your social knowledge, not just the physical aspect, but it's socially constructed. If you know everyone, you can just walk in, and then you can, this is very permeable, so to speak. Part 2.2. So I looked at kind of like how people are using it, and this is something why like a key important issue is that's why I don't want to fortify the notion that everything that is happening in the settlement is housing, because you see this in this map, the red is the residential area and residential, but if you see how it has evolved over time, and the green are areas of, you can see the color code, the places that you visit, so mosque, bazaar, shops, pharmacy, restaurants, and all of that, and blue is primarily related to work functions. And you see that, of course, yes, by it's largely a housing, but also it has a very generous mix of a lot of all these other functions that make it livable. So there is a lot of diversification of from housing, it changes into, you can see here especially how a bazaar has formed, converting the residential areas. But also this was a largely rickshaw garages and a lot of informal transport depots and stuff like that, which also converted back to housing. So there is this dynamic interchange going on in time in terms of the functional mix. Oftentimes people talk about informal settlements that it doesn't have a lot of public space, and it doesn't have public space in the sense of clearly designated park or however we're used to thinking about formal public space. But once I started to map, I see this, people form public spaces even in a narrow lane. So there are all these different public spaces which might not be formed intentionally, but nonetheless, as you can see in this picture, all these are at a different scales of public formation. Again, so I'm just going over. I mean, there are like different categorizations that I talked about in detail. So this is kind of like the third aspect, which is kind of like looking at an urban planning lens, so which is tenure and governance. Now, tenure is usually thought in terms of the property, official or legal property. So in terms of the legality, all that you see in red okay. Oh, okay. So all that you see in the red is where the settlement is. The blue is the government land. The red is illegally occupied in the strict sense. Now, of course, there is a lot of dispute about this land, and that's the reason that the settlement started, is because the ownership disputes are in court, and then it's in a limbo. The government, there is not exact idea of who owns it, So of course, this dispute allows it to grow. But if you go and then you look into a house, you'll see like this, nameplate that, that is given even from the government, which kind of like gives it legitimacy. So even though they don't have fixed tenure from the state, they have some sort of de facto tenure there. So, okay. How do I stop this now? Oops, okay. Okay. All right. So these are in terms of the different sort of rights. So in general, within Karail, you have 20% of people who quote unquote own the houses. So you can think of them as landholders, and then 80% are people who are renting it from them. So you have like tenants, 80%. And this is an analysis of the different sort of rights that they use, or what they can do. They can, what they can build, they can sell, whether they can. So that analysis. I'll, But now if you start to look at in detail, and you start seeing that the ownership, the de facto ownership, is very uneven. Now, what I mean by that is, you have someone, if you remember the house with the 40 rooms, that person, she has control, let's say de facto ownership over this large chunk. But then you have someone who has, imagine this person, and he has only one room, and that's the only thing he controls. So there is very wide sets of ownership, and this is against the myth that only the mafia controls it. The entire land is taken up by gangs. So all these notions of criminality and illegal mafia landlord who own everything about Karail, because these are the myths that go on. These are not really, this map kind of like disproves that the ground reality is, there is a lot of variation in terms of that ownership, the de facto ownership. So now in terms of governance, now I started to map out the social relationships between, what are the, so it's not just like people are there, like these are slum dwellers who just go and build their house. So there are these different social formations. The lower half of the diagram looks at the social formations within the settlement. And then the upper half are larger social formations that, that extend beyond in the city. So of course you have like the landholders, different group and tenants, and then there are lots of shops, so shop owners, and now they start to form this. They have like committees that run the mosques, local development committees, political party wings. They have savings group. They have bazaar committees. They have committees that work with NGOs. So all these different social formations, and they have different set of power dynamics, and they have different set of power dynamics because they have a different set of relations and sort of like informal relations with agents in the formal city. So a political party wing obviously has a formal relationship with the political party, but even NGO committees that work with NGOs, they have an informal relationship with political parties. And then you start to see that the police, they have an informal relationship with the political party wing inside the settlement. Now you have international donor agencies who fund local NGOs, and then these NGOs have relationship directly to them, but also mostly through the committees here. So all this, both national and international actors, they end up having influence in how the urban production goes on, even within the settlement. There is no way that we can see the urban production going on there as something separate than how the larger state or larger formal structures operate. So again, I'm not going to go into this. I'll just come to my final point, really. So this is kind of like a summary of the three modes of governance that are there. So there is, a political party has a strong influence, and another is kind of like NGOs, so a developmental governance. And then beyond that, there is a local grassroots governance, which is concerned about the well-being of the settlement itself, and it doesn't have that outside influence so much. So this is more like a homegrown or a very local sets of governance. So again, this is another map just to show that there are different neighborhoods within this part of the settlement, even within that 500 by 500 meter by 5 meter. Different people, different local leaders control different parts. You see how the form is often, the form here is clearly indicative of the difference between who controls this area and who controls this area. So this it's a very distributed mode of governance. So it's that's like a very polycentric mode of governance within the settlement. There is no central authority who controls everything together, and this is quite an important findings. So if I just use the last 5 minutes to discuss like all the things that we have seen, and I understand that I've gone through a lot of things. If we ask what are the organizing processes of Karel's morphogenesis, and then we'll ask what are the sort of relations that assemble it. So if we just try to summarize what we saw, then probably we can start to see three different modes of urban production. So you have a very individual where, very disorganized in that sense, where individual people or individual person, they come and they build one room at a time without coordinating with others. So, and that's a very rudimentary form that happened in the very early stages in Karel. But then you have a more collectivized form of growth where you have many of these people who then start to know each other, and then they start to say, okay, let's group together and let's make a collective, and then let's build together. So you have this collectivized governance, collectivized growth. But then what happens is also you have a form of syndicated growth where one of these people, they start to have these connections with the larger NGOs or large, the outside political parties. They start to get a lot more influence, and then they start controlling the urban production. And I'll give you like straight examples. So if you see the first level and you see this in a very early part, you see that the growth is very haphazard. Like there is no coordinated, the laneways are like going this way and that way. This is the time when they were just building, they didn't know each other, and then it was quite uncoordinated. So it's very individualized. They were not concerned about staying here for long. They just needed a place to stay, and then they just built. So this is kind of like a desire to survive. And then another layer is where you see a more collectivized and a bit more organized. So on this part, which happened, let's say in the middle years, and you see this, and this is quite organized because it was a collective decision. Everyone is going to get, similar length of plot, and then they can extend equally, and they have to maintain. And that's why you see kind of like a repetition. But this is done in a collective group decision. The next level, the most recent one that you saw on the northern part, and you can see that it is actually more regular, and you see it's more standardized. Almost the housing is becoming a commodity. And in truth, that's what exactly is happening. This is no longer built by the people who live in it. This is built by a syndicate who now build this housing and then they sell it. So no longer you have a sort of a production by the people who are living in it. So, and then in this one, you start to see that the repetition, for example, here you'll see that it's a 4-unit apartment that's being repeated. And then the logic is you build, you sell it, and then you build more. So whoever, now, you transfer the de facto ownership, but the people who just buy it, they come from very different parts of the country. You can just, if you have money, you can come and buy it here. And of course, it has a very different set of social relationships, because in other areas, the one that I showed before, it's you have to know other people to build. You have to have a lot of social capital. In this case, if you have money and you build it, so it has a very different flavor. It has a very different atmosphere. So even within like 200 meters of each other, and you see that all these different ways the settlement is growing. So again, just a diagram to summarize the different ways that it has happened. Again, the individualized, collectivized, and syndicated. I'll finish in 2 minutes. I think my time will be up. So again, so when I say there is no self-organization, because I think when we say self-organization, we can mean any of the three. So if we don't talk specifically whether it's an individualized production, if it's a collectivized, or if it's a syndicated one, we fall into the trap of saying or talking in very generic terms. So that's kind of like what I'm trying to really dismantle here. And if you see the growth that we saw in this diagram, the red is the syndicated and the blue is the individualized. And you start to see that initially it was all individualized. There was a middle period where there was a lot of collective going on activity. And then from 2014 onwards, the settlement has been more syndicated, really. And if you remember the growth part that happened in 2014, that's actually when the election happened, the last election, 2014, and the national election. So after that national election, there was a huge influence from the political party. And then that outside influence allowed a sort of a faster rate of syndication. And then you see the modal share changing, and the settlement slowly has very little collective growth, or collective decision making anymore. So I think I'll just I'll just stop with this, and I'll just go and show that, of course, there are different actors that they act very differently. So this was like showing the different relations. So, some of the relations that constrain the growth, for example, state demolition, some of the relationship with civil society enable it. So, for example, local lawyers and they go and fight for this residents. They do like protests and everything to keep the settlement. So that goes on a more day-to-day basis. There are lots of alignment between the formal city and the informal. There is a lot of recycling that's going on, a lot of help that is given, so reconstruction after fire. So a lot of positive aspects that happen with the city. So that's also sort of relations that enable, yeah, I mean, just to show that the whatever is going on here is not separate from that larger city, and the larger city is always in some way part of that production that's going on. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of like my presentation in very brief, and I just had to run. So okay, all right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tanzil Shafique. That's an interesting elaboration on how the findings seen through assemblages, how identifying, firstly, the interconnections between different actors across different binaries that make it work, and secondly, the different modes of settlements production itself. Lastly, the study recast the settlement as an manifestation of a landscape of intersecting desires in an effort to speak of housing in a new language transcending the stifling dichotomy of top-down or bottom-up. So for our next speaker, Assistant Professor Renuka Devi shall be talking about rethinking housing with respect to cultural identity. As we all know, culture is a complex idea. So we often use the term to refer to things like food, holidays, clothing, music, and religion, but it also goes much deeper than that. Behaviors, customs, beliefs, and values are also part of our culture. So when we meet people from different backgrounds, we can sometimes find that there are big differences in how we see the world, even if we dress in a similar way or speak the same language. Now, how does the culture identity is being looked into the housing development? Without further ado, I welcome to our Assistant Professor Renuka Devi to start the talk, and the room is yours.
Thank you, Professor, and I hope you can see my screen. All right. So yeah, without any delay, I'm going to start with the presentation because I have, again, a lot to cover. So basically, I'm going to talk about rethinking housing with respect to cultural identity in India. And here, this is a picture where everybody is showing a national identity card, which is an Aadhaar card, and a voter's ID, which kind of puts them, which kind of tries and puts them into a larger group, which kind of gives them an national identity. So for me, identity is something that makes me different from rest of them, and it kind of categorizes me and allocates me into a broader group. So that broader group, again, the governing factors of that broader group can be anything. Like it's like a huge list. It could be religion, it could be caste, it could be my interests, it could be my day-to-day activity, it could be my work, and so on. Indian cultural identity, basically there are three parameters which kind of contributes to it. So the first is location, climate, and context, then the belief systems, then the routine that they follow every day. In India, we have, again, several societies, and societies are divided based upon different geographical locations. And again, we have religion coming inside, which, like, India has 6 different major religion that we follow. And other subdivisions such as food, clothing, and language, where one kind of tries to identify themselves to other people. And to very major extent, this also over a period of time, traditionally as well as in modern times, all these are tried, and then all these are tried, people try to reflect all these in architecture, especially in house architecture. So this is one of the maps that I did. So this is basically, this presentation is a combination of my master's research project as well as my general observation throughout the country, whatever is going on, and as well as I have found different scenarios in different parts of the countries, and I've identified and I've added that into the presentation as well. So here you can see the different parts of India. So you see the houses, the traditional vernacular houses and the modern houses in different states of the India from say like 1800s or even before that, which is kind of coinciding with the whole architectural language, which is kind of continued till today. Only thing that changes is the spatial organization according to the modern lifestyle, as well as the materials. So incorporation of modern materials like concrete and glass and steel and metal corrugated sheets and so on. So there is a lot of need for cultural identity in the country because of the following reasons. One major reason is the migration. So immediately post independence, there was a huge need for people to find different jobs because the whole system of living changed, and then they have lost a lot of jobs, like during the world wars and so on, during the war of independence as well. So people started moving to other countries in search of jobs, not just other countries. They would be like, there could be a lot of internal migrations as well. So during these process of migration, they kind of again want to somewhere relate back to where they started, to relate back to their cultural background. So most of the time what people did was, this is one of the house examples from Kerala. People from Kerala are known to migrate to Gulf countries, and people like such as from people from Andhra Pradesh who are known to migrate to American cities, and people from Canada, people from Punjab who again migrate to Canada and so on. So here we can see these people who migrate to outer countries and like outside their state, they kind of like come back or leave or build some part of their cultural aspect in their hometown or in the village that they belong to. So this is one of the example of the houses that you can see, which is basically it has a lot of traditional elements which we can relate to, but at the same time modern functional spaces that they can relate to at current stage. So this is one of the example that I have, like of a really old traditional palace house. You can see how the roof is very similar, and wooden details, basically these wooden seating details that are again translated into concrete and so on. So there is some kind of necessity for people to connect back to their cultural background and ancestral background and familial background. And globalization. So if we see housing in India, a lot of globalization has been done here. And globalization again, led to mass housings and mass production of the housing, basically. So repetition of the same typology, or the repetition of the same spaces that include the expressions again and again repeatedly in to form a society is again the trend right now. But this homogenization of spaces again limits people from expressing their own cultural identity, and many of these societies that exist right now accommodates people from different cultural background. And we can see that this kind of provision, like in terms of design and in terms of construction, has a lot of restriction in terms of expression of identity. And so what people generally do is that they kind of start to so outside they can't do anything pretty much, so they go back inside and then they try to arrange the interior spaces according to their cultural background. So this interior space many times becomes very eclectic. So this is like a combination of their ancestral background along with the cultural products and objects that they collect from the travel that they go everywhere. So it's an amalgamation of things put together. So there is another reason where so after 1940s, that is after independence of India, so people the joint family system had shifted to nuclear family system. So people who had like tens and hundreds or even hundreds of family members in the family who actually lived in one house. So right now segregate into bits and pieces, and then they move to different parts in the same locality or in the different locality. So people even now they tend to gather together in order to celebrate family functions and celebrate weddings and births and so on. So this is one of the example of a Chettinad house courtyard, which is actually a cultural space. This is a climatic space, but also a cultural space where people kind of gather to celebrate the familial activities even to this date. So people tend to this. So this is an image of a traditional house. But on the other hand, when people start to construct new houses, they also try to incorporate these elements into their newer houses. So this is one of the example of the modern courtyard right now, which is there. And you can see similar activities happening over there. This is like the replication of the same cultural courtyard into a modern outlook. So there are different existing private housing systems that are available right now in India. So one of few of the major, very famous and popular schemes are to have an apartment building, and the other one is a row house scheme, and the other one is where you are given a set of regularly planned plots and you can construct on your own. But the trick over here is that the builder or the person who kind of is in charge of this whole locality decides the elevational aspects of the elevational aspects of the houses, such as this. So you can see in this image. So most of the elevational aspects are controlled by the builders. So you don't have much freedom to express whatever you want here again. So in all of these housing schemes that are available right now, the private housing schemes, the people who are living in the houses, so it's basically again homogenization of spaces, homogenization of lands. So basically you don't have a freedom of choice of expression here. And this is the existing public housing system where it's even more tighter here, and the spaces are very minimal. This is like one of the example of a slum redevelopment, low cost housing, where this kind of here altogether, at least for the people over here, some of the activities, outdoor activities, like that they can carry out in balconies and terraces and verandas are still considered. But here even that is not considered in many times. And that's why these projects, especially in this country, in many states it failed, because it did not consider the cultural values or the cultural aspects, like the daily routines and activities of the people whom they want to accommodate here. So this basically belongs to the lower income people, and many a times people refuse to move in here because it is not closer to the workplace that they kind of work, and it is very difficult for them to commute. And this again does not accommodate many of the day-to-day activities that they kind of carry out or perform in their own houses. So this is one of the examples of a public housing scheme like MARA. This is Maharashtrian Housing and Area Development Authority. This is one of the housing in Bombay. So even here you can see the homogenization of spaces. But again, this is a very multicultural kind of people live in here. So I was like living here few years ago, and from where I come from, I need some kind of open spaces for me to perform various activities. But here it is like very compact and the whole house is closed. You don't have any outside spaces like a balcony or a veranda to even relate to. So even if you have to dry clothes, it's kind of like happens inside the house, and you don't have any other space to carry out. And especially if you have to kind of express your culture during the festivals and functions, you just like have very, very minimal space. You just like have to do it just outside the window or outside the door, where you have a common passage, like where you can enter the door. So some of the people who migrate to other countries also bring back architecture from those countries. So they kind of like, so this is one of the example in Kerala, where from the Gulf country, they have gotten styles like Middle Eastern styles of houses and housing. And from my observation in my research, I have like two different groups of people who are living in the society. One who had a very strong cultural background, and the ones who doesn't have that much of a strong cultural background. I mean, like, you know, basically this in local terms is divided into upper caste and lower caste people. So upper caste people always lived in a very permanent house, in a larger lavish houses throughout the time, and they, when they migrate or when they kind of like want to rebuild their houses, they kind of go back and take references from their past. So take references from their culture and ancestral houses and so on. But there are another group of people who kind of doesn't have anything to relate to. Most probably they have been living in a very temporary house that also owned by different landlords during the feudal system times. So they don't have much of this cultural uh, 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 background to look at. So they kind of adopt different styles of housing, and then they kind of incorporate any Middle Eastern style or modern or Western style and so on. But they also sometimes want to go back to their own locality, like houses in their own locality. They take inspiration from them and they want to again reproduce it. So so this is one of the house that we see. This is a very traditional house, which is a very typical of the one that is there in Kerala. But this house is actually recreated in Chennai. So this is a different state altogether, but then the same typology of the house is recreated here with almost all the same elements. It has no change. So therefore, there is a lot of requirement for people to associate themselves with where they come from. So this is one. There is like other scenarios going on where they kind of conserve their existing ancestral houses. Sometimes they kind of try and modify it internally as well as externally. So this is one of my study that I did, where you see this is like a pre-1940s house. So the house is only this much. So also and after 1940s, they have started to change their religion. So that means they had like from Hinduism, they had converted themselves into Christianity. So this particular part that has been added over here is very typical of any Christian family house in Kerala. So this also is like a language that, you know, that tells other people that this part of the house, or, you know, the conversion of Christianity had gone here and so on. And they had added a lot of rooms behind, like dining rooms and kitchens and bedrooms for people. So as you can see, all these additions, modern additions, has happened at the back side of the uh, traditional house, because they want to project themselves like in certain way architecturally. They want to be identified themselves in certain way architecturally. So when you look at the houses, so basically when you go to many of these traditional settlements, it could be like again in Tamil Nadu or in Kerala. If you go and look at the traditional settlements, by just looking at the house, you can just like identify what is the background of them. So where they're coming from, like what is the religion of theirs and so on. So basically we have the other group of people also. So we till now we saw some group of people who were still able to have some amount of economy to try to express the identity, try to build something. But there is like another group of people where you know, they belong to low income group, homeless and slum dwellers. So they kind of have their own identity, but those identities are not based upon the identity where the middle income or the higher income or someone with the rich traditional background would have. They kind of have the identity or the cultural aspect for them is basically their location, like where they live, and mostly it's their occupation, like what they do. So so if you see slums, like majority of the slums, they do identify themselves with the language that they speak, the location, and the work that they do. For example, Dharavi is all about the people who are Tamil people who live there, but they kind of does not have any take from Tamil Nadu. They kind of like identify themselves as people, Tamil people from Bombay. So this image over here is one of the earliest mass housing in India. So this came in Bombay during late 1700s and early 1800s. And this basically had 3, 4, or even sometimes 5 floors, as you can see, and all of them have to share, like have a 1 or 2 toilets that is provided for them. So so basically they have one room, a small kitchenette, and a washing area. This is all that they have inside. And this common passage that is there outside is all the cultural space that they have, and this also acts as a social space. And one can see how they have customized these spaces according to their own culture. So we can see how they have used door decorations, and we can see some gardening happening here, and we can see how this also act as a service space where they kind of like dry clothes, they store water here, and so on. There's like so much going on here. And this is the picture of the same where during the time of festival, so this is during Diwali, and we can see how one kind of customizes that space in order to make that space unique and particular to themselves. So some of the cultural expressions here, like how they have lit that space and so on, can be seen here. And so this is an interesting example where this is one of the very, very successful low-cost housing in India by Dr. B.V. Doshi. And we can see how he had captured the basic life of people who are there in the slum. So you can see a lot of similarity between these two images. So this is one of the slum from Bombay in a place called Vadala. So you can see the almost the same elements getting replicated in a permanent way in architect Doshi's housing. So you have 2 levels, balconies, you have open spaces, you have shaded spaces, and there is very narrow staircases which is leading to the 2nd floor. And they also have this kind of accommodates their function in day-to-day life, and it kinds of gives them that freedom for them to expand and contract. So in the traditional houses, if we see as a cultural space, whether it's a cultural space or if it is a living space, it is quite flexible, and the increment happens when there is a need. But right now in the modern housing, what's happening is that whether it's the 2 people in a family, whether it's 5 or 6 people in a family, they are just provided with the same area, and there is no scope for expansion either. But if you see in the in case of these slums and how homeless people build their houses, it again goes back to the traditional cultural ways of doing building houses. So as you can see, architect Doshi also gives a lot of choices to people. This is very important, which is kind of not there right now in most of the modern housing societies, where from single family unit, like you can have just 1 room with an attached toilet and bathroom, or you can have few rooms to like 3 or 4 rooms depending upon the size of your family. And you have courtyards, you have narrow streets, and you have verandas, and there are so many activities that are taking place all over, and people are allowed to rebuild or make an increment as and when there is a need. And that's why this low cost housing project had become so successful over the period of years. So this is again one of the interesting slum in Bombay again. This is in Bandra. This is just like, as you can see, next to the railway track, and that railway track is very much in function. Like we used to commute during our work in the same railway track. So as you can see, this is like a slum, but again, in the same, there is like so much of freedom that you can see, so much of sophistication that you can see in terms of the number of rooms, in terms of number of levels, and even they even have like a properly air conditioned spaces over here. They have like dishes, TVs, like everything going on here, like what that is required for a person to conduct the day-to-day activities, and nowhere the functions are getting restricted, so they still have that freedom to express. So I conducted a survey. I'm not again going to go deep into this. I'm just going to go to the overall inference. So I kind of like divided people into different parts, like one school going, the college candidates, and the people who are working, like who are employed, and the ones who are retired. So the people from the younger generation, they want to go, in terms of architecture, in terms of house architecture, they want it to be more modern, but at the same time, they want a lot of cultural spaces where they can still carry out a lot of cultural functions. So they just like need a mixture of these two. And as we see, like when the people age, they kind of start to go back and then rethink and connect with the childhood, and they want to recreate what their ancestors have been, and they want to try to bring back the traditions, and they want to maintain that traditions for a longer time, and so on. So basically, to end with, so cultural identity in architecture in India depends upon two different aspects. One is economic conditions of the family and the cultural background of the family. So in the economical conditions of the family, both the higher income group and the homeless and the slum kind of have the freedom to have the spaces that they want to build. So they since higher income group can hire architects and then avail a house or a plot for themselves, it makes it easier for them. And homeless and slum, on the other hand, with whatever they have according to their daily cultural values and systems, they kind of are able to put things together and to build something that kind of suits their day-to-day activities. And the families with strong traditions again want to go back and bring back their cultural identities in the modern houses these days. And we have this other group of people, like the middle class and lower income. Again, lower income, where they again get a standard income in a standard periods of time, not like hopeless or slum, like the daily wage people. So they constitute again more population in the country. So they kind of are left with no options, because they are kind of pushed to take whatever the housing schemes that are available right now, like what we saw earlier, it either apartment or a row house system, or the plot system, where you can just buy the plot like a standard plot and follow standard elevations and just construct on it. And there are some families with not so strong traditions, but they can again come in like different income groups. So depending upon the income groups, again their necessity and requirement changes. So yeah, this is about it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Assistant Professor Renuka Devi, and as an interesting breakdown on how the idea of cultural identity can affect the characteristics of housing scheme, which include the economic conditions, scales of the building, spatial arrangements, material selections or facade elements, and rational properties to be as symbolic to the local identity in an effort to achieve the display of culture. The discourse is about how we can look into the appropriation of architecture with cultural identity while contesting with the function of housing. Now, our last speaker of the session today, Hail from UTM itself is Associate Professor Dr. Sabrina Ismail, who will be talking about designing elderly housing with sense of communal value. The gist of the talk is about how architecture can have significant contribution to the elderly housing design in the sense of community value. Alternative housing options will be needed to meet the needs and answer to the wishes of the older people. For these elderly residents, a sense of community meant not only living with like-minded people, but also communal activities, doing things together, learning from each other, and having reciprocal support, all of which created a sense of togetherness, belonging, and trust. And with this, I give away this room to our last speaker of the session. Please welcome Associate Professor Dr. Sabrina Ismail, and the room is yours.
Right, can everyone see my screen? Can all of you see my screen? Okay, thank you so much, moderator Dr. Intan. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening to all audience attending this 5th international webinar series. So there's a lot of colleagues and students I know from Intan, Universitas Tanjung Pura, from VIT also, Dr. Madhumati is here, and from SRMST and SASI, and also from Sheffield University, and also my teammates and students from UTM. It's glad to meet all of you. And also, I would like, as the director of the architecture school, I would like to say thank you so much to Dr. Tanzil Shafique, and also to the assistant professor Renuka from VIT Architecture School for accepting our UTM invitation to become the guest speaker for today's international webinar series that actually will wrap year 2021 for all the international webinar series that we have for this year. So for those who are waiting for the next international webinar series, we'll have the next issue in January 2022, which is going to be next year in a few days' time. Okay, so before I delve into my topic of discussion today, let all of us ponder this very beautiful quote by Nelson Mandela. Don't let age change you, change the way you age. And we can change the world and make it a better place, and it is in your hands to make a difference. So this beautiful quote was actually put forth by Nelson Mandela, and if you read back this quote and the relationship that I put in the slides, which is the two elderly people here, one is the male and one is the female elderly, it gives a retrospect to us that one day all of us will become old, and we cannot run from reality, because this is the reality that all of us has to face, and by that time we will be begin to feel our age, and we need to force to pay more and more attention to our physical, to our emotional status. So for that matter, what we have to do is that we need to be adaptable, we need to be ready in actually accepting the reality of aging, and also we need to be prepared on the way how are we going to spend the rest of our lives in the future. So in relation to the quote by Nelson Mandela, on this very beautiful quote, so today's topic of my presentation is actually very dear to my heart, because it discusses on the issue of elderly housing. And many of us in the audience today may still be still young at age. Maybe you are 20, 30 or 40 years old or 50 years old. But you need to imagine yourself, where will you live? And where will you actually be in the next 10 years, 20 years or 30 years to come? So what kind of environment actually you want to live in, and who will be with you when you reach 50, 60 or 70 years old? So this is actually a big challenge for all of us, especially in the well-developed countries like Malaysia, India, Bangladesh, and I think in Indonesia and so many more well-developed countries, because we still have a lot of uncertainties in addressing the issue to fulfill the needs of elderly, especially in providing a better housing provision. So to understand this deeper, the presentation of my topic is actually divided into 8 aspects. So I will actually look into these points for discussion. The first one, I will give an introduction, a brief, what is the elderly people, and then I will look on into the categories of the elderly background, and then we look into the types of elderly housing by looking into the case study of the Malaysian context, and then we look on the issues faced by the elderly housing in Malaysia, and then relating it back to the issues on the elderly housing and how are we going to design a betterment for the elderly housing in the future by integrating the idea of the sense of community. And we will look deeper into the idea and the strategies of having this propagation of how to put forth the idea of sense community into housing schemes and development by looking into the internal and also the external factors. So there will be some sort like a proposal in terms of the design strategies that relate to this sense of community. So as an introduction, we look into the Malaysian populace as a case study. And I think this is actually similar to a lot of countries, especially the newly developed countries like India, Indonesia, like I had mentioned previously. So if you look at Malaysia itself, by the year 2020 and the year 2040, and a lot of scholars had done a lot of demographic studies, and they mentioned that Malaysia will actually become an aging nation. And this is because by the year 2040, and the population of the elderly people will be doubled, especially from the 65 years old and over, and it will increase up from 7% up to 12% from the total population. So if you look at the statistic here, by the year 2040, the year of the age of the 65 years of elderly people and above will reach about 11.4% from all the whole total population of 38 million people in Malaysia. So in this sense, if you equate 11.4% from the 38 million, the number is about 5 million elderly people by the year 2040 in the ranging age of 65 years and above. So if you look in this situation itself, in the year 2020, we almost have about 9.96% of the 32.4 million people in Malaysia are actually containing of the old or the elderly people. And from the 9.69%, you can have about 1.58 million are actually consisting of men and 1.65 million consisting of older women across the country in Malaysia. And Selangor actually is taking up the highest kind of numbers of elderly people, which is about 305,000, followed by Johor, and then followed by Perak, which is 247,000. So the big question that we need to ask ourselves as designers and also as the future architects, where will all these elderlies live, and in what kind of condition that we're going to provide for these elderly people? So if you look in the Malaysian statistic, this is actually the condition of the elderly living place that we have in Malaysia. So in the year 2021 statistic, we only have 12 institutional care, which is registered under the DSW, which is stand for Social Welfare Department or Jabatan Kebajikan Masyarakat, that falls under the category of Rumah Seri Kenangan and Rumah Ehsan, or known as Diam Seri Kenangan Housing and also Ehsan Housing, which is totally provided by the government. And also we have only a number of 233 domiciliary care, which is under the sponsorship or under the maintenance of the NGO, which is the non-government organization. And each capacity of this domiciliary care provided by the NGO can only accommodate about 30 or 40 elderly people per home. And we only have about 6 numbers of private retirement homes. And usually private retirement homes are actually for the high-class people, which is equipped with high-class facilities in terms of medical and also in terms of other facilities that relating to the need of the elderly. So in Malaysia, this is actually the categorization of types of homes for the elderly provision that we have in Malaysia, which is under the Department of Social Welfare, under the NGO, this is under the category of non-profit orientated, and this is under the private provider. But if you're looking at the numbers that we have in the 2021 statistic, the number is still very, very low in terms of the quantity, and we're not talking about quality, and we're focusing on in terms of the quantity is quite low in terms of the numbers that if I mentioned previously compared to the increasing number of the elderly as it grows per year up until 2040. So not only that, if you're looking at in terms of the quantity, if you're looking in terms of the quality also, Malaysia is also having a problem in terms of lacking of awareness regarding the concept of universal design and also its implementation in the elderly housing. So as you can see, there's a lot of elderly housing in Malaysia, especially under the NGO and also under the DSW, which is under the Department of Social Welfare, is still not well designed. according to the social and the psychological needs of the elderly. And this includes the elderly needs for mobility, for safety, for privacy, and also for comfort accessibility for the elderly. So if you look into the elderly categories, and I think this is all the same throughout the world, because if you look into the elderly characteristics, there are four key important aspects that when we talk about elderly people, once they age, they reach the age of 40 or 50 or 60 years old, the question of vulnerability and also the known as the fragile phase. So the fragile phase and the vulnerability actually imposing on the aspects of physical inability, or what we know as impairment, where the elderly much relies on social arrangement. They need more professional care and also informal care. And during when they reach the age 50, it is the problem of known as primary retirement form. So which means that by this time the elderly doesn't have a fixed income, where they usually need to be dependent to their son, to their daughter, or to their what you call that neighbors, or also to their what you call that family members. So this is the important when we talk about the idea of dependency. So much of the elderly need a lot of support in terms of physical and also in terms of economic support. So at the same time also, when we talk about the elderly at this age, is in terms of their demand, in terms of the cognitive, physical, and also spiritual needs. So, ladies and gentlemen, so if we look in the types of elderly housing that is provided in Malaysia, so there is no choice for us actually, because in Malaysia, actually, you can look that we only have four choices that we can make once we reach the age 50, 60, and above. One is to remain in your own home, which means you can age in place. So which means that age in place, you will live in the same housing arrangement or the same housing environment. And also you actually need to be with somebody to take care of you when you have inability in terms of physical needs, emotional needs, and also spiritual needs. So the other option is that whether you move or you go into elderly care or also elderly care institution. So this is usually what you call that depending upon elderly who are the less fortunate elderly, that in terms of having problem in terms of financial or support, and also doesn't have any child or being abandoned by the family. So in this sense, there is no choice, which means that you have to go to a private or in terms of a voluntary nursing homes. And another one, if you have a severe health condition, which means that you have no choice, that you have also need to go to the elderly medical facilities. But in this sense, we talk about medical facilities in terms of economic and in terms of financial support is very important. So which means that you need to have some sort like a financial backup in terms of your saving or remunerations, or in terms of your what you call that in terms of your pension and things like that. So another one bigger option is that you might go to retirement village. So retirement villages is actually where you can live independently, and there are somebody will actually take care of you with a specific or a specialized health assistance needed by the elderly people. So in this sense, in Malaysia itself, you only have about 6 retirement villages, and one of the most famous one is in Ipoh, which is known as the Green Acre Retirement Village. But what I can see, a retirement village in Malaysia is very, very expensive, which means that you need actually to save and to own to have one house within that retirement village. So in this sense, we look back into the issues on the elderly faced by the elderly housing. Number one is that we look into the availability of the elderly homes in Malaysia, which is still low in numbers, mismanaged with no proper monitoring. And the second one is that looking into the lacking of standardization and having the best guideline practices. So this is actually the problem, not only in terms of the designer itself looking into focusing into the idea of designing the elderly housing, but also looking to the policy makers, or what we call at in terms of the government level, which means that there are not much government who are interested to actually venture or to finance in terms of building a proper structuring of housing program, namely for the elderly. So maybe in terms of them, there is no profit making in terms of that, but also this is actually a problem because most of the government, especially in well-developed country, giving less concern and lacking of emphasization among authorities and especially within the sphere of the home providers in providing a good provision housing, especially for the elderly. And the third one, if we're looking in terms of the affordability of the elderly retirement, especially homes with healthcare facilities. So as you can see, the affordability of the high services and the care charges is very expensive in terms of medical treatments and so forth. So affordability is actually a big question here because it will involve a lot of categories of elderly, especially if you're coming from the lower or the middle income group. So at the end of the day, a lot of elderly prefers to aging in place and face death in their own homes rather than going to a proper nursing institution with better healthcare facilities because they don't have enough finance in terms to help them to pay for the medical bills and also the medical facilities. So another problem that we look into is in terms of the contribution from the public and private home developers in Malaysia. So there's little awareness, little aspiration, especially from these public and private sector developers. And most of them are looking into the elderly as the secondary group rather than focusing. They prefer much to focus on the higher income group. So this is the problem of the mindset of what we call the less awareness that actually arises among the community itself, especially among the developers. So this is what we need to change, and we need to look back into our society and how we need to educate the society in terms of creating a better kind of environment, especially for the elderly people. So in that sense, let's talk about your age. So this is the question that I asked all the audience earlier. Where will you live when you reach 60, 70, 80 or 90 years old? So if you are in Malaysia, this is actually the planning guideline for older person that is actually stated by the Malaysian government. So you have three choices that you can make, whether you age in place in the existing surrounding housing that you are in, or you can move to a retirement village, or you can go to a care center. So there is not much option that you can make when you become a senior people or an elderly people. So in that sense, we did a few studies looking into three examples of case study by observation, and me and some of my students did this as our master's project in our design studio. So the student go and did a lot of surveys and observation into three aspects of housing, where we go to the Rumah Amal Syekh. This one is actually funded by the government. And Rumah Warga Emas Nur Ehsan. This one is actually funded by the NGO. And also the Rumah Jagaan Orang Tua Ceria, which is under half NGO and also half sponsored by the private bodies. So as you can see, this is the quality and the condition of those three housing for the elderly. And I hope that you will viral and share these pictures to the rest, because if you can see in terms of the living spaces, in terms of the spaces that is provided by the elderly is still inadequate and still lacking in terms of few and a lot of aspects. As you can see in the picture number one here, the bedroom space is actually more like a dormitory, and it's actually shared a lot among the elderly residents. And what only segregates between the female and the male residents is just only a wall that is built between the residential spaces inside the housing. And also there is not enough ample cleaning and drying area, because this is actually an elderly housing that is actually retrofit from a terrace housing, turn it up into an elderly housing that accommodate about 30 to 40 elderly within one block or two block of terrace houses. So as you can see, the furniture arrangement is also try to make adaptable with whatever that they have within the spaces. And also in terms of safety, fire requirements is also not fulfilled in terms of the passive and active safety. And if you look at the eating spaces, is also very crowded, and also the kitchen and living spaces is also the way how it was arranged is more like a terrace housing, a retrofit to become a dormitory for the elderly people. So there's a lot of problem actually arises in terms of accessibility, in terms of how the housing scheme are actually extend according to the needs and to the growing number of the elderly increasing by year to accommodate what is the elderly want in terms of the public and also in terms of the private spaces. So as you can see, there's also a lot of problem because there's not much in our public spaces. So what at the end of the day, the elderly has to move out and eat at the porch area rather than having their dining area, which is inside the elderly housing itself. So this is actually the common layout that one of my students drew when they did this observation visit to this particular elderly housing. So as you can see, it is very crowded, and the elderly housing design is actually adaptable to whatever the spaces that they have according to the budget that is being given by the government and also by the NGO bodies. So at the end of the day, as you can see, there's not a lot of many spaces for the elderly to socialize, and everything is very cramped within one space area. And also the problem is in terms of the lacking of greenery spaces. So this is actually increased a lot of problem in terms of the elderly, in terms of their social behavior, in terms of their emotional development, and so forth. But there is not much that we can do because it is actually in terms of the design scheme, because this is much more funded by the NGO and also funded by the non-government organization. So there's more pictures here, as you can see, in terms of how the way the beds are arranged, in terms of the eating areas, and also in terms of the public spaces. So one of the things that are becoming an issue is that in terms of the lacking of personal spaces for the elderly. So this is quite critical, especially because some of the elderly are facing diseases like Alzheimer, where they tend to forget their wayfinding, and also they have dementia. So this is one of the issues. So at the end of the day, much of the dormitory are designed just to suit according to whatever the spaces that they have available within that area. So another example that we did a visit is in the Rumah Amal Syashir. This one is located in Selangor. So it's similar like the one previously that I showed you as a case study, where it's retrofit from a terrace housing turning into a living for the elderly housing. But this one is quite a bit different because the landowner actually provide the land, and they have a bigger ample land to provide for this elderly housing. But still, the design is still quite cramped in the way how it was designed, where it doesn't have much safety for the disabled people, and also the planning and the design is not based on the elderly requirement in terms of their safety and also in terms of their needs, accessibility, and also in movement. So what we did was that we did a questionnaire with 150 elderly living in these three types of different categories of home type. And most of the elderly mentioned that what they want is that they want to live within a spaces that they can be part of the community. So in this sense, they prefer, 22% prefer that they want a lot of spaces with public interaction, where they can do a lot of entertaining, where they can have a lot of spaces when their family comes to visit, and they want a bigger spaces for gardening and also for therapy, and also to have a spiritual spaces, what you call that, a private spaces to conduct their spiritual activities. So at the end of the day, what we can do as a designer is that providing a better space, a better quality of living environment for these elderly. So in this sense, we are looking into the idea of injecting the what you call that, the proposal of sense of community or sense of belonging within the elderly spaces. So if you look into the idea of sense of community, actually there are four categories that highlights the idea of sense of community. One is about to create the idea of membership or the feeling of belongingness. Number two is talking about spaces that can have the ability for the elderly to express their freedom, to have integration and also fulfillment of needs to be togetherness within within a confined space, but within a comfortable space. And the fourth one is talking about how can you create a space that can share and have an emotional connection between each elderly. So in this sense, we look into the study done by Fernandez Ballesteros. So Fernandez Ballesteros had done a study on trying to create a sense of community or a good environment for human behavior and also for human culture or for the human people. So what he did was that he outlists that there are actually four important categories when we talk about development of a human within the living spaces. One is on the environmental quality. Second is on the functional capacities and looking into the leisure and also the activities that is going to be provided by the human within their dwelling environment. And the fourth one is looking into how you can integrate the dwelling environment with the health and also with social integration. So if you look at the study done by Shavis and Wandersman, when we talk about membership or feeling of belongingness, the idea of form making and spatial organization is the two dominant characteristics that actually make up sense of community. And I will actually explain these two in detail. So by explaining that in detail, we look at few examples at the global context in terms of the elderly home. One is in Austria, in Spain, and also in Switzerland. So this is how the way they design by having a lot of open and public shared spaces where they have the centralized shared garden, which to allow social interaction within the big groups at all involved level. And we talk about having shared corridor by having and providing a wide shared corridor, but it's actually illuminated with daylight morning and day. They can get what you call that, a natural daylight from the exterior. And also one of it is talking about interconnection and interweave of pathways. So it's a very clear connection of pathways and also wayfinding cues. And this is very important when we talk about sensorial experience, especially for those elderly who are having dementia and also Alzheimer. So this is actually can give them direction to where they should move and where should they go, and providing them with colors that can stimulate also their eyesight. So another one, if you're looking at the external elements, which is in terms of the form making, and this is more into the physical character of the fittings or the furniture itself. As you can see, one of the picture here is in Austria, the way how they integrate the idea of greenery within the interior fittings of the housing itself. So this create what we call a lively kind of environment and also expression. And another one is in terms of the facade treatment by using a lot of integration of aesthetic elements like colors and rhythm. So this one can actually give them sense or direction and also wayfinding once when they are at the exterior part of the building. So this is the elements that we come up. There's a lot of important keywords here. One important one by Zaf and Devlin, they're mentioning that when we talk about elderly, it is very important to provide a lot of courtyard and green spaces. So this is the explanation. I won't go one by one in detail, but you can read it here and I will share it in YouTube and you can see it in detail. And another one is to have a clear visual linkages from all the spaces. So it's better that it is to be easily seen and visible from far and transparent. So at the end of the day, once when the elderly moves from one spaces to one spaces, it can be easily monitored by the what you call that, by the people who care for the elderly or also by the viewers. So at the end of the day, the elderly will feel safe and secure within their own living spaces. And another one is talking about reachable distance. So, which means that for every steps that the elderly move within 20 to 30 steps, it is best to provide them benches or sitting areas so that they can rest and they can utilize the spaces to have a social activity or interaction. And one of the most important thing is that to have a very huge and wide double loaded corridor for that they can move from one space to one space, and this is actually can enhance the residents' sense of community within the spaces itself. And according to Rosenberg and Frank also, it is important to create some sort like a quasi public spaces, or known as micro spaces within the big spaces. So this is where the elderly can actually mingle in smaller groups, rather than be in one group or in a one large crowd, so that it is actually can create more interaction between them. So, and another one, if you look in terms of the colors. So colors is also another important scheme for the elderly, because it can create some sort like an ambience, and also not only from wayfinding, but it also can promote security, healing sensation for the building occupants, and this can actually promote positive feelings among the elderly itself. Okay, and another one, if we look into, is in terms of how the interior fittings or finishes of the interior should look like. For instance, the flooring materials, the finishes, the structure, and also the texture. So this is quite important, especially to make the elderly feel at home, even though and can create some sort like an entirely environmental friendly kind of environment for the elderly. And another one that we need to look into is to create a home-like kind of appearance in terms of the facade style. So most of the elderly doesn't prefer a kind of a huge or monumental scale, because they much prefer to have a humanized and architectural scale, because at the end of the day, they want to feel this idea of satisfaction, and actually they want to feel a kind of an attachment to the space. So there's one study done by Fornara mentioned that if you're designing an elderly housing, try to avoid a kind of a facade style appearance like hotel-like or the usual standard kind of facilities, because will actually impact in terms of the emotional behavior of the elderly itself. So as a conclusion, this is what can I say, relating back to the sense of community, is that to elevate the life quality of the elderly towards a kind of a positive aging. So it is very important actually to improve the elderly health development. And to have that, we need to, as designers, we need to actually pay contribution actually into the two main aspects. One is in terms of the internal elements, and another one is in terms of the external elements. So in this sense, we need to look into how we design the spatial organization, and also how we design the fittings, the fixtures, and also the usage of colors. I know there's a lot of nothing a lot can be done in terms of what we have in especially in bigger cities, and most of the big concept that we need to do now is time looking into the idea of retrofitting. But if everybody have this sense of awareness, I think we can provide a better elderly living, especially for the elderly in the future. So I think that's all from me. So thank you very much. And I pass it back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Associate Professor Dr. Alice Sabrina Ismail. That's an interesting take looking at the framework elaborating on the findings of the study, which showed that moving in later life can offer a viable option of having a living environment that one likes, which calls for a broader interpretation of housing policy guided by aging-based thinking. For housing schemes are developed to fulfill the need for a housing type that provides mutual support and social context while alleviating this isolation and loneliness often experienced in ordinary neighborhood. So now we have come to the Q&A session. Thank you to all speakers involved. Now I would like to open the session to Q&A. Should you have any question, you can open the mic and feel free to ask question, or you can put your question in the chat session and make sure you quote which speaker you want to deliver your question for. Okay, so I have collected few. I will read it out. Is Dr. Tanzil written yet? Or I will, yes? Ah. Okay, Dr. Tanzil. The first question, the slum housing in Dhaka seems like it is like a housing scheme built by non-architect. Are there any government interference in determining the planning pattern of the slum housing, or is it totally solely dependent on the needs of the community?
If I get the question correctly, the government has in some way influence over where the settlements are built. So oftentimes the settlements, housings are built in government property and government land that are not used. So of course, in that regard, yes, but the government does not have any direct influence in the architecture of the settlement. But also the government do have other, housing rehabilitation projects. I think Renuka was showing some similar projects. So there are some slum rehabilitation projects where when there is a slum eviction, some of them get housing. Those are built by government. But more, I mean, at large, yes, the settlement itself, the architecture is built by the community. Yes, I would say that.
Okay, another question. Still for Dr. Tanzil, from your research, in this kind of morphology housing arrangement, are there any social issues arises, and how does the community sustain and adapt with the conditions?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, social issues are, of course, I mean, when you're sharing such, congested spaces, there are lots of social issues, but I hope that you mean social issues in its broad sense of both positive and negative things. So the community, in some parts, they have very high social bonding. So sometimes, when you need, for example, if you need daycare, you can leave your child with the person living next door. So there are, lots of bonding that's kind of like makes the housing affordable. So of course, there is social cohesion, but at the same time, there is a lot of social disagreements and lot of, sort of like fighting because, of ownership, because a lot of these things are not formalized. So there is a scope for interpretation in terms of tenure, in terms of, so there are lots of disagreements, but usually they have some sort of a mechanism to, alleviate the problem. So there are like local councils, very informal councils by the local leader who tries to, maintain that social order, because maintaining that social order is key for the settlement to grow, because if it has that social order, then more people are likely to come as renters. And if it's not working in terms of its internal social cohesion, it doesn't work as a housing. So the community understands that. They understand that they have to make it livable for the renters. So essentially, there is some sort of mechanism that always tries to correct, the social problems. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Tanzil. So a question for Prof. Renuka. How do you summarize the architectural cultural identity based on current situation in terms of its benefits to the country and its people?
To summarize, I mean, there are a group of people who have only access to what is available. That what is available is again governed by so many bodies. It could be architects, it could be government, it could be local bodies, and so on. And they have and that has to change right now in the way they look at especially when it comes to multicultural societies, when it comes to multicultural housing. So they have to look into that and provide more choices for the people rather than standardizing everything in terms of spaces, in terms of the expression, and so on.
Okay. Another question, still for Prof. Renuka. In your opinion, how can a designer integrate and implement the elements of cultural tradition in modern living housing?
So it can happen at various levels. So first of all, the designer has to understand the people who are going to occupy that space at one particular point of time. The designer, especially in the mass housing systems, it's quite tricky because there are vast and wide ranges of people from different all over the country who would come and then collaborate in that space. So so the architect needs to understand the array of clientele that he has before just like deciding what has to be given or provided for them in a very standardized way. So and again, so if we see in many of the so this is like just in the starting stage of the mass house development. So if you see in many of the even the metropolitan cities have housing communities or housing societies that kind of like have the population where they kind of like come from one particular background. So even that kind of possibility can also be explored. And there is like another possibility where people from different cultural background comes in one society, and what are the choices given for them? That has to be relooked right now in a modern architectural perspective.
Okay, thank you for the answer. We have a question for the third speaker, Dr. Alice. How significant does culture play in a part in the design and implementation of elderly housing in Malaysia?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Intan. Well, if you talk about the elderly people, of course, culture is very important in determining the way how the elderly live. So this is actually very what you call that, very serious actually in terms of how we're going to design, because when you talk about the elderly, they have a very unique kind of a living way of living. Because if you at the very young age, you might behave differently and you are being very active, but once when you grow old, there's a lot of passive elements actually, and it enters the way how you live. So when we talk about culture, this is when I show you examples of how we should design the housing itself. So which means that the housing needs to have a lot of more open space, greenery. So we need to create more kind of a sustainable kind of environment, especially for the elderly. So it's yeah. So in this sense, culture is actually playing an important role for the elderly living actually. So we cannot deny that statement actually. Yeah, I hope that's answered the question, Dr. Intan. Because if you want to elaborate on how to design culture living within the spaces, there's a lengthy kind of an explanation to that. But I actually are looking forward, and I can share my slide to all those who are interested to know more in terms of designing the spaces for the elderly people. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alice. Question for Dr. Tanzil. In this informal or organic urban setting, what are the roles of architects? Can architects involve earlier on in other or similar developments?
Well, I think, of course, there is a lot of scope for improvement. There is a lot of, places where architects can get involved. So one particular way that architects can get involved is to move away from the idea that the architects will design a perfect building and then give it to the people, because in a very early modernist way of thinking, what we can think of ourselves as more like allies or helpers. So in general, as Renuka was saying, was how do we understand why they're doing what they're doing, and how do we sort of like work with them to make better choices. So if it's a better structure that you can think of, it's more like a horizontal conversation that needs to happen between formally trained architects and dwellers in such settlements, rather than thinking that we already have the solution. Yeah. So of course there is scope, but not in the more traditional way that architects have been involved.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tanzil. Okay, a question for Prof. Renuka. In modern cities, typically affordable housing is much determined by developers, and the owner don't have much room to redesign the facade, and the much that we can do is retrofitting. In your opinion, how can we still integrate the idea of culture into housing using the approach of retrofitting?
Retrofitting is one part, but again, the retrofitting on the exterior is not permitted in many of the housing schemes that's available right now, and that's where we need to look into some kind of flexibility where the users can involve and try to customize some aspect of the same, and so. so what is happening right now in India is that so we have, like, especially in an even in the row house to an extent it's possible, but in terms of apartment buildings it's kind of quite tricky to do that. Although there are some few of the builders who are offering to the clients that they can modify the spaces in the apartment buildings also according to their own need. Um, so it's like how Charles Correa had designed housing in Bombay. Each of the houses is not the same; it's very different. And again, it caters to different people with different cultural background, with different standardized activities that they kind of perform throughout the day. And this is one thing, but it's not in many of the cases it's not been done, or it's not becoming possible because of various reasons. One is it's kind of very easy for everybody to just reproduce whatever has been done. So this much of material is required to reproduce something, so the same, they either reproduce horizontally or vertically. So this happens once, you know, this kind of customization or retrofitting that comes into picture. That means that's a lot of work for the builder. That's a lot of work for the contractor who is involved in that project. So also it depending upon the level of the customization, the cost also varies, and the profit to the builder again kind of minimizes or maximizes depending based upon it. So all these other external factors are kind of getting influenced in terms of expressing or curbing the freedom to express the identity in terms of housing.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Renuka. Okay, another question for Dr. Tanzil. In your opinion, do you think these settlements of housing pattern arrangements strengthen the social cohesion among dwellers living in that settlement, as it provides ample freedom to the dwellers to determine the design and provide individual identity to the dwellings?
I think absolutely. I think it's the process that matters. So, you know, in the northern part that I showed you, where people don't build their house, they just buy it from the, you know, from the land mafia. There, the social cohesion is much less because they don't know the next door neighbor. But in the southern side, where the progress was slow, but also it was, you know, done collectively, that process of building together, that process of, I'm talking at a kind of like a social level, not that individually they express their identity in the architecture. That's of course essential, but you know, given the circumstances, they don't have much choice. I mean, you know, in terms of the material, they make minor adjustments in their, you know, you can see some patterns, some, you know, windows, they have some flowers in them. So of course they make some, you know, minor adjustments, but given that, of course, you know, the availability of materials, the cost, all of that, you know, they don't have that much option in terms of, you know, building whatever they want. So even if they're building something similar, what is crucial that the process of coming together and that agency of you know, expressing collectively that you are building your neighborhood, that sense of ownership and sense of belonging, that, oh, my father built this one 10 years ago, you know, I grew up here, or that sense of attachment, that's what is so much more in the southern side where they build it by themselves. So of course I think that's a big you know, issue to learn for architects, like how do we enable that in the formal housing that we design? How do we take into account how the users can be part of that process of designing? So how can it be co-produced? How can design be co-produced? Because you know, even if you give the best designed house to someone, it doesn't have that same effect of, you know, making him the kind of like, you know, the architect, so to speak, in that sense. So I think, of course, you know, that idea of social cohesion through the building process is key. But I mean, how, you know, how do we move forward as architects? if that's something that we understand that's something so crucial, I think, my counter question is, how can we work for a developer, build a apartment building, but also think of how do I allow the future users to be part of the design process? I mean, these are open-ended questions. We don't know the answers because no developer wants to pay for these experiments. But I think these are important experiments to do.
Yeah, that's very well put, Professor Tanzil. And the same thing again, I think it's kind of like globally the same thing is happening, not just like in one country. Like how like the capitalist approach for housing is dominating rather than, like a collaborative approach rather than, yeah.
Thank you both, Prof. Tanzil and Prof. Renuka, for that answer. We have few more questions for Prof. Renuka. Okay, interesting to understand the migration of styles by local working outside. Does the construction methods changes as well due to their experience from abroad? How architectural design contribute to the issues of slums or housing, where most of the slums are created out of necessity and economic needs?
Okay, with respect to the construction methods, right now the widely accepted and used construction method is use of trabeated structure with especially concrete, glass, brick walls, like most of the places. So it kind of depends upon the economic capability of that family, if they are willing to again involve much more complicated construction technology, even that is being made possible, but that again is in a very smaller proportion. And this is happening on one side. On the other side, there is this very traditional and cultural methods of construction that they had used for vernacular construction, using local materials, local methods of construction and processing and so on. So that is again is in the verge of getting lost because there is no school or no social group or like no group like to revive those construction methods and technologies. So right now there are like some of the organizations like Intan and some other like private organizations who are up to revive these vernacular housing techniques and technologies, but again they are not practically used in the building construction systems yet. So that has to be looked into. And when it comes to the issues of slums or housing, yeah, it is kind of quite true that some slums are created out of necessity rather than it's not a luxury. But they still have the freedom of choice, freedom of expression, even in the slum, even if they don't come under like any of the economic, like higher or middle class in terms of economy of the country. But the thing is, in the redevelopment or rehabilitation projects, like what the government floats, many a times architects are not direct part of it, and they are not the decision, like the primary decision makers. There are so many other factors, like from making it low cost to making it identical to make it like easy for everybody to construct. So from there, it starts like the architects, at least in India, has to be involved more in terms of slum redevelopment. That is one issue. The other issue is that whenever there is like slum relocation, so basically if you see, many of the slums in this country are located in a very, very posh areas, like the land values are very high in that place. So when they are relocated, this land value becomes one of the very major issue, where people doesn't want them to relocate in the same area because of that land value. They want to relocate into some other area where the land value is lesser. And that's why the whole system, like how they function and their like commute between the work and the residents, everything get disturbed, and that's why this rehabilitation systems does not work. So I hope that covered the question.
Okay. Another question. Cultural identity is something subjective. It is not an object, but a way of life. But architecture is translated into something solid and pragmatic. Based on your presentation, I am interested to know more on how do you translate the cultural identity into architecture? Is there any specific indicators or key points or process you used in translating each cultural values gathered into architecture, or in this case, houses for the people?
Yeah, cultural identity is subjective, that's true. But this is not something new that we are doing. So it's been happening for ages in throughout the history. So certain people in a certain culture build a house in a certain way. And when you look at the houses, you immediately try to relate to the house. Although none of these houses are the same. They have their own individual qualities in their houses. It could be like spaces, elements in terms of scales. But then once but it has also been used as like it's kind of a language that you kind of try to express to other people. So throughout the history that it has been done. So right now it's basically, how we again look at this issue, how we can give more choices to people in terms of expressing their cultural identity is what we have to look into in the modern housing societies. That is one thing. And if we see in terms of, as far as when I did my research, like when I did my study, nobody wants like to go back and then live in a house that has been like, 100 years old. They want something which is kind of a mix of whatever has been there already and whatever that the lifestyle that they have right now. The spaces which relates to that lifestyle. So they want an amalgamation of the both. But mostly in many cases, the cultural identity or expressions in the architecture comes in the form of elements like external elements rather than spaces inside. And to an extent, the spaces are also it is like said, it is kind of subjective. Some of them want in terms of spaces also, but many of them want in terms of like the external expression, because that is easier to achieve, like no matter like in what economic class you are in. But for you to have like a courtyard in the house or like a lavish terrace or veranda, that requires some amount of other factors that is required for you to achieve those goals. So it again depends upon various what they need, but maximum people look forward to express in terms of external elements.
Okay, thank you. Another question, still for Prof. Renuka. As researcher and academician, in your opinion, what can we contribute in construction industry for the new housing development, since there are a lot of study has been done about the importance of cultural identity should take in consideration in new housing development?
So over here in India, we have like, many of the housing schemes, even before they start to construct, even if they must be like, probably the builder just has a piece of land, like in acres. But in that, they'll just like create a drawing, and they would already, they would like start selling the houses even before it even start to get like, materialized like on site. So that is like the stage where I feel that they have to involve or include the conversations between the client and the architect, because even before the building is constructed, you know who your clients are. So that could be like one of the ways where you can understand the client's need in terms of expression and cultural spaces that they want inside the house, and then build based upon it.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Renuka. So a question for Dr. Alice. How do you educate on the community for the needs of a proper elderly housing for the community?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Intan. A very good question and a tricky one. Okay, when we talk about education, it actually should begin from the foundation. So when we talk about foundation, we talk about architecture schools, and also we need to give awareness, especially students at the primary level. in terms of how you actually show your gratitude or actually show your respect towards the elderly. So I think this is actually embedded in a lot of moral subjects, especially when you are in primary students, and how you actually should respect the elderly in that sense. But when as you grow older, especially if you go to the tertiary education, this sense of values actually erode itself, because there's a lot of what you call that, influences of technologies and the way how you live in society. So you have the tendency to forget about the elderly and what is their role in society. So this is in terms of the awareness had actually need to go is a kind of a process of ongoing process in terms of educating ourselves, especially our young generations, the primary students, the tertiary students, and especially students actually at university level. I'm not talking about student in a very big general kind of a picture. What I'm trying to focus is that architecture students itself, because most of us when we design buildings, we talk about the tendency of having building in monumental scale or sizes. You know, we talk about the more the big, the grandeur, the scale of the building, the more you will score an A for your project. And when you have that kind of mindset, we have the tendency to forget not only about the elderly but also the disabled people. And when we talk about disabled people, sometimes students also forget to integrate the needs of the disabled people within their design scheme itself. And because they're more focused into having more kind of an architectural stylist kind of architecture, looking into form making rather than into space making. So this is actually very important, especially us as educators or academicians. So we need to play our role in actually educate our architecture schools and also our architecture students and tell them that doesn't matter, it's not about designing building, it's not about scale, it's not about monumentality, but it's about how the building actually can serve the society. And today actually has shown a very good example by Dr. Tanzil and also by Prof Renuka when they talk about slums design building, because slums is more architecture. So Amos Rapopo is always talk about when sometimes it's good to have a building that is designed by non-architects, because when it is designed by non-architects, the building is more attached to the society, because you know how the society behavior and how do they live. And this is what the sense that we want. Because when you give something to a professional architect, the tendency of talking about costing, you know, you want bigger projects, you'll get more money, you get more funding from a lot of people and from a lot of agencies, and the more bigger projects that you have, the more untung, or what you call that, the more value that you can gain in terms of financing the projects. So this is back to basics, you know, this is back to basic understanding and back to the basic of human values to it. So how do we measure architecture? Are we going to measure architecture in terms of the scale, the monumentality, or in terms of the costing? The more, the higher the cost is, the better it is. Or is it in terms of how that architecture can serve the society? You know, I like the example that Dr. Tanzil showed, the slum areas in Dhaka. You know, it's just a simple building, but how it can accommodate a lot of people within one scheme. And also the project done by Balakrishna Doshi, you know, one of the good example, and looking the model of the slum areas and making it to a kind of a comfortable living for the society that affordable for all. So I hope that answers the question, and it goes back to us as designers and also goes back as architecture student. We need to think back, where do we come from and what do we want to be in the future and how we're going to serve the society. And that is the value that needs to be embedded in terms of our thinking. So yeah, that's all from me, Dr. Intan.
Thank you, Dr. Alice. Back to Prof. Renuka. Prof, what are the cultural elements relating to housing? And as a researcher and academician, we all know globalization affects culture generally, both from the students and stakeholders. What advice will you give in terms of harnessing culture into our modern housing?
So if we study, like, you know, without the users, if we just like look into the houses or the buildings, which are like very culturally rooted, the cultural element starts from the entrance. Like, how do you enter into your house? So there's like a particular I mean, every culture has like different ways of even like from entering into the house. house. Move in spaces require see, like originally in traditional vernacular architecture, nobody ever had something called as a bedroom or a dining or anything. Those are all modern additions right now. So they just like had multifunctional spaces. So it could be like just a room which kind of like acts into so many it could have so many functions, which actually kind of even right now, like after getting adopted to so much of modernization in terms of how we function, we even right now a particular room or a space, although it has a label, it has, like, you know, in reality so many functions. The living room has so many functions. It's like a social space for men, women, like how that space also doubles up, like you know, as a dining. In many of the houses, if you see right now also, like there will be a dining table in the house, but they wouldn't use the dining table ever. They would just like sit in like the couch or on the floor watching the TV or talking to someone, like, you know, where they form like a comfortable group and then eat. So unconsciously there are so many aspects, like, you know, practices which are still there. So in terms of, so we can look at it in terms of the spatial requirement, like what is the spatial requirement to accommodate these kind of functions. I mean, you don't even like require a dining hall. In Kerala, in almost all of the examples of the houses that I studied, they had a dining hall or a room, but they never used it. Even when they gather for functions like marriages or any other family events, they never use the dining table. They kind of like sit on the floor, because you just like eat on the banana leaf, like whenever that happens, and so on. So that is one, like spatially is something that we have to focus on, like the what are the activities that, you know, people are involved in. And the other thing is the elements, like, you know, it could be roof, it could be colonies like verandas and courtyards, majorly courtyards. So in many of these uh, modern housing system, the courtyard is not even like in question. There's no courtyards at all. So if you see in Dr. Doshi's projects, so he has like different levels of courtyards. Like he has one courtyard in the house itself. He has like a group of houses which are sharing like another common courtyard. Again, that has like another specific function for it. It's like a social gathering of different hierarchy. So all these spaces again have to be included, rather than looking space as, you know, right now it's just like 1 square meters is equal to 3,000 rupees, and that's it. Nobody looks beyond that, like what that 1 square meter space like can you know, can also provide. That kind of approach of looking into the areas, the land has to be changed. So that's like one of the reasons where people don't waste any space in mass housing systems. Like all of the spaces have to be commercialized and it has to be constructed. So these are some of the aspects and elements and spatial qualities that we'll have to look into as architects when we are building housings.
Okay, another question. How do you think a good way of educating the new generation in order to appreciate their cultural identity?
Uh, so yeah, I think over here in India, the new generation is also like, even whether they want to or not, they have to be part of all the cultural activities. And right now, although they are like half-heartedly participating in all of these cultural activities and events and spaces that they can accommodate and how they use their spaces and so on. But over a period of time, once they come to the stage, like where they kind of like start to earn and then work, where they have to make their own decisions, uh, their own decisions in terms of creating spaces, like their own houses, building their own houses, or buying or investing in something. That's when they get the clarity of like what they actually want. So right now, my advice would, like, for all the students and everybody who are like young, would be to just like to have a strong so it's since I also teach history, I always say this to my students, like where you see it, it doesn't matter what kind of architecture that you're creating, but you always have to know where you're coming from, what's your cultural background, and what did your ancestors do, how did they live, and what are the activities or like cultural values that they had. All that you have to know. Only if you know that, you will be able to create spaces for somebody else who also is expecting all of those qualities in the space.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Renuka. Any more questions from the floors? The collected questions already delivered. So I open if anyone wants to ask, you can turn on your mic. While waiting, I will share the attendance link. Okay, which I will attach at the chat box. Okay, please fill in order for you to get your e-certificate. Okay. Okay, I think yes. Is there anyone who wants to give a question? No. Okay, so I think I will wrap up. Okay, thank you. I have closed the Q&A session since we have reached to the time given. Allow me to summarize the content of our speakers today. Okay, speaker number 1 on the lesson from informal housing, about how the spectre that haunts how we think about housing, describing in binaries, in oppositions, in essentialized identities, whether it is in formal or informal, north or south, social or spatial, product or process. What does a more nuanced understanding of assemblages? Okay, this study outlines a conceptual framework where housing is rethought as an unfolding of social, material, processual relations and desires forming a field of intensities. Appropriate incorporation of culture, lifestyle, and changing needs with architecture created a more beneficial and intimate social setting for the people now and future. Okay. For the second speaker on rethinking housing with respect to cultural identity must be well interpreted, which otherwise the architectural purpose and function tend to symbolize and showcase power and the authority of the patron or designer. Thus, there is a need for designers and scholars to have clear awareness and understanding on culture identity, role and purpose, and function for the future housing development in shaping a country-built environment. As for the third speaker, designing elderly housing with sense of communal value, the co-housing communities among other older people, or which include older people wherein they provide self-organized reciprocal social and instrumental support, are increasingly popular nowadays. The built environment can facilitate an increased sense of community, social connectedness, and opportunities to socialize among elderly residents, demonstrating the benefits of creating environments that are conducive to elderly residents' interactions and socialization. For example, shared spaces and proximity of living units can maximize opportunities for companionship, development of social relationship, and participation and satisfaction with social activities, as well as relate to less perceived loneliness. Now I would like to ask the attendees to open your camera, as I would like to take a screenshot of your photo session today to commemorate the webinar series 5. Okay.
Sorry, Dr. Intan, while waiting for the participant to switch on their camera, I think there's one participant who are asking that they could not fill in the link given in the chat box. So they need permission to access the Google link. Perhaps you can allow for the permission.
Okay, wait, I will check first. Mm,
Kindly, all participants, please switch on your camera. And I hope Dr. Aiman, can you help to snap the picture while Dr. Intan is attending to the Google link?
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So everyone, turn on the cameras, please. Okay, I'm gonna snap a photo. Those who doesn't have a camera or is not opening up the camera, I have to omit you guys. I'm afraid. Hold on. Show presentation without video. Okay. Right. Page 1, 1, 2, and 3. Smile. I'm afraid there's no page 2. Only page 1. The others, do you mind opening up your videos? No. So 69 participants are hidden.
Okay,
I'm
no
gonna
worries.
take another one while waiting for the issue to resolve. 1, 2, and 3. Smile. Yeah, we have only one page. I'm afraid.
Okay, no worries. I think we have about 101 participants for today's event, which is quite a good number. So, okay, guys, I think please wait for our another international webinar. Is going to be in year 2022 with a lot of surprises. So, and a lot of hot issues that we're going to discuss on architecture in year 2022. Okay, so Dr. Intan, I think you need to check back on the Google link.
yes, okay. I'm not sure because I already received 83 responses.
Please end it, please.
Okay, so
It's getting confusing.
macam
Looking at the settings.
because there are still some who couldn't access, like Nazish, Iriani.
Not sure how to unlock.
Oh, because we have participants from UITM and they're mentioning that they could not access the Google link because the one only with UTM address can actually access the Google link.
Okay. Okay, not sure how to do the setting here. Log mode.
Or perhaps those who attend today who actually won their e-cert, maybe Dr. Intan, you can share your email so they can email it privately and then
Okay,
you can
sure.
give the link privately to them.
Okay, sure.
To all participants who can't access the Google link, please email to Tengku Intan Suraya at utm.my and give
Yes.
your details to Tengku Intan and she will email you the e-cert individually to all of you. All right. So I think we come to the end. Dr. Intan.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Dr. Alice. Now we have come to the end of the session. Thank you again to our speakers, Dr. Tanzil Shafique, Assistant Professor Renuka Devi, and Associate Professor Dr. Alice Sabrina Ismail. Thank you also to the audience. It was a pleasure to have you all with us. So this concludes the webinar series 5. We from UTM hoping that our collaboration doesn't end here and hoping that there is more to come between University of Sheffield, VIT and UTM. So thank you all for attending. We hope You have a good day ahead of you. Goodbye for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Renuka, and
Thank you for
also
having
Dr.
me here.
Tanzil.
Yes,
Yep, thank you
Aziz.
so much, and hope to see you next year.
See you all later.
Yeah, hope to see you all next year, 2022. Happy New Year to all. It's just
Advance
3
Happy
days
New
more.
Year to all.
Okay, take care and stay safe, everyone.
Yeah.
Goodbye, all. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.